and welcome to the Intentional Clinician Podcast. I'm your host, Paul Krause, licensed professional counselor. Today on the podcast, I will be interviewing Kent Dobson. He is the author of a book called Bitten by a Camel, Leaving Church, Finding God. He's the host of the excellent podcast, Hints and Guesses. He is the lead teacher at C3, West Michigan's inclusive spiritual community, and he is in the Soul Apprenticeship program at the Animas Valley Institute in Durango, Colorado.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here. Appreciate it.
Absolutely. I'm very excited to talk about a lot of topics we're going to get into, which people can see in the show title. One of the first things I wanted to ask a little bit about was a little bit more about your biography, as I believe it will relate a lot to what we're going to get into today.
Yeah. Well, some of it is actually in my book, Bitten by a Camel. I do try to, in a somewhat chronological way, talk about how I grew up, which is in evangelical Christianity, in a pretty fundamentalist Baptist kind of place. My dad was a pastor, and I kind of went to the top of that world, meaning I eventually became a mega church pastor, whatever that is. And at that point, I guess the wheels started coming off. And not in one fell swoop, but a whole series of things that led up to that, including I went to graduate school in Israel for a few years, and that was the beginning of my disillusionment and unraveling when it comes to the biblical text and sort of the origins of how I understood faith. Yet in a way, I tried to patch all that back together and say, I got to keep going, and so I guess in some ways, once I reached the top of that world, something was wrong. And in that sense, I started a more serious kind of descent, and break from that world, but without knowing at all where I was going. There was not an alternative. It wasn't like, hey, I'm going to quit being this and now I'm this. There was no conversion. Right. It was more like at the beginning of the Inferno. Dante says something like, in the middle of my life, I awoke in a dark wood. That's what it felt like. It was a kind of waking up, but a kind of lostness at the same time. And, ever since, I guess in many ways I'm still in that chapter of my life, but that sort of led me down the path of eventually writing about this kind of exit and descent process a bit, and also taking more seriously the call of the soul and what is this thing, and dreams and underworld work and all this kind of and psychotherapy. I went and got a therapist. All the stuff that began to expand who I thought I was in the world, or I began to discover who I thought I was in the world. There was something beneath that, is probably a better way to say it. So that's not really a bio, I guess. It's a little bit of coloring, I guess.
Well, I like that. Whatever it was, I liked it. And if listeners want to know more, it's an excellent book. I would recommend reading it. And also what I did was audible.com, and I have no sponsorship, so just go for it.
Yeah.
So you can hear all about Kent's background, but I really think what you're starting to delve into is what you're into right now, and this part of your life where I guess we can call it a descent. You started with disillusionment, and I think from hearing your podcast and sort of what you've been into lately, you're really drawing on many sources to be able to understand what you're going through, even though it's kind of a mystery now. I mean, there's like that second, I guess I think it was Hollis calls your second part of life, or Jung called your second part of life, where things aren't orderly anymore.
That's right. Yeah. The old order doesn't work, or the series of tools that you've collected and maps that you've collected on the way don't work. It's not like they're totally irrelevant. It's just they don't work in the same way. Something like that. Yeah. Yeah, and just as you were speaking now, it is a bit of a mystery. Like, maybe most people are like this. If they really contemplate, how did I end up right here in this seat talking to you, for example. I mean, no amount of calculation could ever weave together such a weird narrative. And same with the kinds of things that I'm into, like Jung and or a Bill Plotkin or Hollis or Hillman, or those were not on my reading list in college,
right.
you know? And so how did I fall into this? It's kind of like a trap door, and it is a bit of a mystery. Although in hindsight, I guess part of the ego tries to make sense of it. And there were some early invitations in my own kind of spiritual wanderings that I think led me down a certain path. I think one of those people is Richard Rohr. He started saying things, and I was like, wait a minute, that's not exactly the Christianity I grew up with. And it seems way more expansive on the one hand, and also way more challenging. And there's almost a direct line between Richard Rohr and sort of Bill Plotkin for me, because he started talking about some of Plotkin's things, and Richard Rohr has a book about rites of passage, and I was like, what the hell are these?
Yes.
And I felt a kind of longing. It tapped a kind of longing I didn't know was there, and I guess that longing is what started to wake up, and then you just follow that wherever the weird road leads you, in a way.
Yes, just a couple of things that sparked my mind about that was one of my mentors has always said the Western world has no agreed upon rites of passage culturally because of, well, I guess he's specifically talking about the United States in that sentence because we're all from somewhere else. And there's a whole collection of narratives and differences and cultural pressure and spiritual, religious influences that can make us up, and we haven't collectively agreed on it. And so he says usually what happens is something terrible happens, and then that's your rite of passage, is getting yourself out of that.
Yeah, you're right in that. Or the agreed upon rites of passage are much more in the realm of entitlements, like I get to drive because I'm 16. Right. Okay. I get to vote because I'm 18 and I can smoke cigarettes and play the lottery, you know.
Right.
Or and we even treat those, or even when you graduate from high school, well, now I get to go to college and I get to have a party where people are going to give me money. That's not a rite of passage. In a way, it hints at it because, like, the timeline is right. That's the timeline, the traditional historic timeline when you're either going to become an adult or not. So the culture almost says we have to have something, but then what it's come up with is just largely entitlements and I guess that, I don't know if there's more to say about that. It's just kind of paper thin, maybe.
And I think it's also confusing for young people, and I know I was confused as all get out, because I think you think there's got to be something more going on deep. There's got to be a depth to this. There's got to be something. It's not just that I had an open house and everybody gave me money, and now I'm 18 and now my parents can't, quote, tell me what to do anymore. And now what does that mean? Now I have to establish something. What is my story? And, you know, the great thing about the brain is that it's always making up a story. It's always making up a narrative. And I think that's probably how we evolved. And I mean, that's what some scientists say, is that we were able to evolve because we had story, because we had language, and we had a way to share our associations mentally. So not to go on that whole tangent, but getting into kind of, we talked about rites of passage and your own kind of journey off the beaten path. And I guess I'll just say it, part of my journey also, I'm not going to get into my biography, but also started with the disillusionment and confusion, and even going to psychology school and learning counseling. That's a whole vast spectrum of a world. And there are ways in which counseling can be towing the cultural line and trying to indoctrinate people into a unhealthy existence, an unhealthy materialistic surface culture, and say, you know, just have to cope with it. Just cope with it. You're thinking wrong. Instead of listening to the depth. And so then my own, I guess, further descent was letting go of my fear of actually reading more than a few quotes from Jung, and actually reading Jung, and actually working with a depth psychologist, and making James Hillman confuse me all day, and reading Hollis, James Hollis is a bit easier to read and more concise, but also being like, okay, I'm in this process. I'm part of this process. And what is this process doing to me? It's not really clear. It's not clear cut as it was, okay, learned graduate school, then you learn these techniques, then you see patients. It's not clear cut anymore. Now, these patients, usually the people know what to do anyway. Mm-hmm. They know what's going on, but they don't have permission or they don't feel like they can.
Yeah.
So that was a psychology segue. So back to you in terms of, I would love to know more about some of the things you've learned personally and also from these great teachers, and some things that you found that are interesting for you right now.
Yeah, that's a hard one to bite on, really, because one of the things that I'm learning is that transformation is slow and it's very subtle. And sometimes you can have like a breakthrough and a breakdown, or maybe that's the same thing. But then to collect up those pieces in some sort of, to integrate that kind of breakdown or breakthrough is also part of the slow work of transformation. So sometimes I ask myself, what have I really learned? Where am I now? What truly have I experienced? Because I think there's a kind of cycle, and this is a super simple way of thinking about it, but I come from a world where, a religious world where beliefs were front and center. And what you need to do is have the right beliefs. You have to believe this about God. You have to believe this about Jesus. And basically, if you get the beliefs right, you're okay in the afterlife, first of all, but you're just okay in general. And as if God is a person who peers into your belief systems. And but I think growing up, period, is coming to the very limits of that belief system. Like, all right, whether I really held those beliefs or not becomes kind of irrelevant. It's like you realize, oh, whatever this container is, it's only brought me so far. And I think maybe the traditional word for that transition point is something like faith. That's where faith begins. And I mean it only in the sense of I'm going to venture into the unknown here. And there maybe are some trusted guides or guide-like images or ideas that say, keep going into the unknown. That was true of the voices that I bumped into. And then it's almost like that creates a kind of possibility. This faith-like dimension of the unknown creates a possibility for some kind of experience. And then maybe the cycle starts over again. All right, so I'm having an actual experience of my life that's now reshaping my beliefs. That was kind of a long way of saying this is something I've been thinking about, and it's actually hard to say how have I changed my mind. And I think maybe it's worth saying that for me, I think when my world first started unraveling, I was looking for a system, a philosophy, a teacher to put it back together again. And maybe it was Buddhism, or maybe it's Judaism, or maybe it's Bill Plotkin's map of the psyche, or maybe it's Jung, although there's too much there to, right. It's not concise enough, no one can understand it. But maybe someone will put the world back together again in an organized fashion, but that's not what happened. I think so. Maybe my experience is that in a way I'm learning that I'm a mystery to myself. And every time I collect up more of the deep self, I'm only integrating little bits and pieces instead of like, I found the thing, or now I can make full sense of my history and my experience and my motivations. And no, there's a subtle invitation to integrate just a bit more. And maybe I'm learning if I can learn to treat myself as a kind of mystery, maybe I can treat other people that way too. And I mean, you sit down with people. Actually, Jung says this. He says, the person in front of you is not a statistic, Mm-hmm. And that's why I resist at times things like the Enneagram I'm not totally against it, but the Enneagram or the Myers-Briggs or any of these, or the more simple ones like I'm a porpoise and you're an owl or something. I'm not saying there's zero truth to these, but I'm saying it's too convenient. It's too convenient. Maybe it works in a kind of symbolic or metaphoric way, but it's too convenient that you are a mystery to yourself. And the person in front of me is not a number. They're not a 4. They're not a 1. They're not a 9, And I guess to me, that's something that I'm coming to believe, I guess, that I didn't at one time maybe think.
Yeah, and I was just reflecting on that. There's a lot there. So feel free to interrupt at any point, because I'm just going to try to jump on a few of those. Okay. What I'm hearing reminds me a little bit of the growing up process, but also the process of being a child. I think when we're a child, according to psychological development, if we just go straight to the science of it, children need a box and a container that's safe. And we need explanations of the world that make sense. And we need grand narratives or stories or fairy tales or myths to teach us important lessons. And we also learn it through doing. I mean, there's the other side of, I guess, parenting, the shadow side, which is that your child actually learns more from what you actually do and how you live than they ever will from them, you reading them whatever important text you think is important, or kind of disciplining them or lecturing them. And then in the second, everyone's second part of life, I think, starts at a different time, but where you're starting to see things, the old ways don't make sense anymore. The simple belief system of checking the boxes for orthodox beliefs or checking the boxes for being a good, citizen or whatever aren't working for what's going on underneath the deep river of like the soul, I guess we could call it, or the psyche. And so part of me thinks that part of that represents our growth. And I think culturally, what we talked about earlier, our culture resists that growth and wants to keep us with simple explanations. And, well, that leads to another quote, but leads to, kind of a consumer culture. I had a quote about that, and I'll get to the second part. You can interrupt at any point. But this is a James Hollis quote. But he said, "Today, as we have seen, fascism and communism are discredited, but are replaced by a paraphilic consumer culture driven by fantasy, desperately in search of distractions and escalating sensations, and a fundamentalist culture wherein the rigors of a private journey are shunned in favor of an ideology at the expense of paradoxes and complexities of truth, which favors one-sided resolutions, black and white values, and a privilege of one's own complexes as the norm for others," which is in his book, Why Good People Do Bad Things. Reminded me of that. And it's hard because, just you talking about, growing up in an evangelical religion and all of that, that gives an opportunity for somebody who's not really listening to you to label you.
That's right.
And to say, you're a this. Oh, and then you left? Oh, now you're a this.
Yeah.
Now that's easy for me to dismiss what you're saying instead of really listening.
Yeah.
And I think and on the same side, people that are, trying to open up into more, it's also a temptation to label others. Yeah. And so I hear what you're saying is I'm trying to just really see where people are coming from and where am I coming from? I don't even know. But I love this Hillman quote, and I'm almost done.
Yeah, do it. Let's hear it.
But he said, anytime you're going to grow, you're going to lose something. You're losing what you're hanging on to keep safe. You're losing habits that you're comfortable with. You're losing familiarity. And I actually think that's from one of his talks. That's not from his book. But and so it's scary. I mean, just to even for you to publicly admit, I was an evangelical pastor and now I'm not. And I'm not by choice, and there was no scandal. I just decided to not do it.
Yeah.
I wasn't taking everyone's money or whatever.
There were times I wish there was a scandal, It's because it's easier to make sense to yourself and to other people.
Right.
I don't get it, You didn't sleep with someone, that's the way it's supposed to work. Yeah. It is a loss, and people are afraid. Partly because, there was a lot in what you just said, and also in
go anywhere you want. Yeah.
No, but I was thinking about we have identity politics right now, and on the right and the left. We have a kind of identity spirituality, if there's such a thing. I sort of just invented that, or maybe other people have said it, I don't know. Which seems to be totally motivated by group identity. I am the group that I'm in, and again, true on the right and the left. I don't care how sort of progressive, or in the opposite extreme. Fundamentalism is not the domain of the right. Fundamentalism is everywhere, and that's kind of what he's saying. And the group and group identity trumps the wild, unique individuality of people. Maybe that's why on one level, even though I don't feel like I fully understand what Jung is talking about, he's the simple way of saying what is Jung into? He's into individuation. And which is different than just becoming an individual, I think. But individuation, this difficult, painful, exhilarating, and life-affirming, and also in a way process, is not the pull of the culture. Even though we sort of bow down at people have rights, but again, that's much more in the realm of what would you call it? Egocentric concerns. My rights, my life. That's not individuation, I don't think, in any simple sense. But anyway, my main point was, I think any kind of spiritual growth in a general sense, those strong categories that people are going to go to war for start to lessen. You start to see them not as completely irrelevant. I mean, maybe it's a part of natural growing up, like you were talking about children. We do need categories. We do need some labels. We do need. I'm not against race, for example.
Sure.
I mean, you can't tell a young white person or a young black kid that they're not that. No, they are that. This is part of how we come to know who we are. It's just not all that's there. And that's the problem with this kind of identity spirituality, identity politics. The clinging nature of it just wants to keep things, I think, in those clearly defined categories of who trumps who, But anyway, what was my point? My point was to expand is to, I think, to go closer toward the mystery of human individuality and the soul itself. Yeah.
Yes, and so much there. I was going to just make one comment before I go into the individuation. Was I've been having these thoughts about how people's perceptions of the world are changing. And I think they're possibly changing through multiple factors, including the internet and the news, and what information you consume on a daily basis is shaping you. And I have many theories that if people were having more conversations face-to-face that were from different quote-unquote tribes or ideologies or political realms, we would find more in common than apart. Mm-hmm. But when we talk through filters, and then we're listening through filters, we're talking through filters, the news, the internet, different ways that are not direct communication, and then we're listening through ideological filters that have said, if somebody says this, that's over the line, they're definitely a this, and that means that you can't trust them, and in fact, they actually may be evil. They actually may need to be taken out. Mm-hmm. Like, that's where it goes.
It does.
And I feel that we're in sort of a postmodern, post-truth culture, and so then that brings up more fear, because there's information everywhere and no one knows who to trust. Mm-hmm. There's some disillusionment. Remember, I don't remember if you remember this. I can't remember. Some famous CBS journalist made a confession. During the Iraq War, I sort of made up part of a story, and I apologized. And everyone, like, I remember me going, well, isn't that what everybody's doing on the news these days? Yeah. And like every magazine's like, you don't really know if it's news or journalism or some sort of advertising. Mm-hmm. And he's like, apologizing and nearly crying. And then all of the people from his generation, I remember talking to some older folks who had grown up, I can't remember his name, but they were like, I can't believe it. Not him. Mm-hmm. Now we don't know who to believe. So then more fear. Yeah. More fear stokes the need to identify with the group, because here I am, now I'm in the wilderness again. I need a group. I'm afraid to embrace my individual story. That's too scary. Let's stick with some easy stuff that'll quell my fear momentarily, but it just boxes you in.
Yeah.
So that leads right to what you were talking about, is the mystery of the self, opening up to soul. Breaking down of the ego is necessary for that to occur. And acceptance of the shadow. I've just got to throw that in before we maybe dive in deeper. I love this Jung quote from Modern Man in Search of a Soul. He says, "How can I be substantial if I do not cast a shadow? I must have a dark side also if I am to be whole." And I think that's another thing I'm seeing in culture lately. People are, I mean, and on the positive side, or I don't know, whatever. On one side, there is an opening up of authenticity and realness, and people talking about wanting to have more authentic conversations. What's it like to be a parent? What's it like to be in that religion? What is it like to be a paleo? What is it? And everyone's telling about their truth about that. On the other side, I'm seeing when people make mistakes, you're done. You're canceled. You're crucified. There's no redemption path.
Scapegoat mechanism.
And it's all projection. We've all done, maybe not, things on the news, but we've all done bad things. And we all, that part of growing into your soul and breaking down is accepting that I have a large chasm of opposites within me. A capacity to do things we could label as positive and things we could label as negative. But
for sure. Wherever. I mean, this is it. This is what our culturally, culture on a thin level is just completely unwilling to do. It's so much easier, and it pays the bills, meaning advertising pays the bills, to have CNN and Fox News, and they just go back and forth. The enemy is over there, and Trump is the problem, or Hillary Clinton is the problem, or whatever the polls are. And one of the things that Bill Plotkin says, which I think is funny, he says, one clue that you're getting close to the shadow is you hear things like, well, the one thing I know about myself is... So an example would be, the one thing I know about myself is that I'm not like Donald Trump.
Right.
That's the one thing I know. Then you're probably getting close. You're getting close to the thing that you're unwilling to eat, meaning the shadow. Unwilling to take even a single bite of the shadow. Or the one thing I know about myself is that I'm not. The one thing I know about myself is I could never be. Those are just, I'm not saying you've discovered the shadow. I'm just saying those are little hints that you're getting close to it. And in a sad way, but before I say something about that, I was thinking about the big stories. Like, you're right, kids need stories and culture needs stories. And we live in a world where we're not sure what they are anymore. We're sort of at the tail end of Christendom. And I don't know what's coming next, and I'm not even predicting that it's going to die. I'm just saying, but something about it has run its course, and it's clearly not ordering culture in any way. So it's hard to know what story I'm in. So when I get to the middle of my life and I wake in a dark wood, instead of seeing that as part of a larger pattern, which is what the great stories do for us, they say something like, you're okay enough. You're part of the big story. We don't have anything like that. So the anxiety it goes through the roof. We don't have elders that are saying, actually, it's time for you to go out on a vision fast. It's time for you to leave the village and not eat. It's time for you to go on a wander because you don't know who you are. People are just left to their own devices, and maybe they have a therapist or a counselor, and that's fine. But it's sort of like without these larger narratives, in a sense, to help create a frame, I think it's becoming increasingly difficult to try to name what kind of story we're in. So I feel like I'm talking out of two sides of my mouth at times, which is something like individuation is the great call here, which is a descent to soul, something like that. And down there, you discover something of your own wild, unique essence that you can bring forth in the world. But that does align with the big stories, The big stories of great change and transformation have something like this in it. Like I was thinking about Abraham. There are the three tiers at the very beginning of the Abraham story. So God apparently shows up and says to Abraham, leave your country, All right, so that's an identity. Leave your people. So that's another layer of identity, and then leave your father. And now, and that's just to start the journey. But what we're basically saying is don't ever leave.
Right.
Like religion is saying don't ever leave. We've already figured it out. Abraham kind of did that for us, or Jesus did that for us. We know who we are. So people never get close to the journey, you know? So I don't know. I feel like I'm personally wrestling with how much do we need the old narratives, the deep narratives, the old myths and stories on a symbolic and metaphoric level. How much do we still need those? And I think the answer to that is I think we do, to help frame this wild, unique process of, you know, sort of our own individuation and discovery. So does that make sense as a question?
That's uniting. Well, yeah, that's uniting the opposites because it depends. It's when you said on the symbolic level, you're talking about how are we reading these stories? Mm-hmm. How are we reading them as an informative text that can spark something within us for us to learn and also transform and also have a spiritual experience? Mm-hmm. Or are they a factual textbook of box checking that we're reading somebody else's interpretation and not letting it work on us?
That's right.
And so kids need that. They need stories. I mean, if you look at the Grimm's fairy tales, Louise von Franz, I'm butchering her name, wrote a whole bunch of stuff about the fairy tales, and Joseph Campbell talked about all the creation stories and all the different stories of that are mirrored in the Bible are mirrored in other cultures and other religions all over the world that are fully documented in piles of text. Mm-hmm. And so we need some sort of story. Humans thrive off stories. We need a story, and I think it's difficult to have that story. But then it's again, how are we reading it? And how are we utilizing it? Which again gets into the belief versus action.
Yeah.
You know, you go to church and you hear, I believe this, I believe that, I believe this. And then, you know, that's where our younger self maybe gets disillusioned. Well, wait a minute. I met you outside of church and I didn't feel that you believed what you're talking about. You know what I mean? Like that, that sort of younger self. So now I don't want to get totally into those weeds.
Okay.
But the idea of having a frame, but also then the individuation part is leaving the frame. And I feel like perhaps maybe needing the frame is the beginning part of life. Mm-hmm. And then where you're at right now and where I've been kind of dipping my toes into is what if there is no frame and the frame is in you. You've already been installed with that information, but now every day is opening up to not knowing and unknowing and seeing what's there. I don't know if that made any sense.
Yeah. Well, maybe it's something like this. Like if you come back to the Abraham story. So in order to go on the great adventure, he has to leave his culture of identity, including his own father. That's no small task. And as you probably know, as therapists, some people have never left home. They may live in a different state from their parents, and they've never left home. Mm-hmm. So anyway, Abraham's story, it's not even an important question, was Abraham even a real person? You know, or do I need to believe that he literally walked from Ur to Canaan? He may or may not have. My archaeology professor used to always say, well, I don't know, I wasn't there. You know, that was always his answer to things. So the beliefs about the historicity of that are kind of, it's like the wrong rabbit trail to go down. And also, it's not a direct application. It's not like, oh, I see, I must follow exactly what Abraham did. Or even to make it a little more controversial, I'm supposed to follow what Jesus did if you're a Christian. Well, how? You know? I mean, that's living someone else's life. The invitation is almost something like the pattern is there to create a kind of container of which emerges out of the middle your own wild and unique way of embodying the pattern that's there. So how might you embody the pattern of leaving home would be the question. Or how might you embody the pattern of the Christ figure? Meaning, and there's be a lot to say about what exactly is the Christ figure. But it's not, I should do things the way they did it. Like it's the wrong question. Remember those bracelets? What would Jesus do? You know, maybe it's a good starting question because it maybe gets you thinking. But the right question is, what am I called to do? And and on the pattern level is something about my own waking up and suffering, the combination of those things, a little like the great patterns, a little like the great archetypal patterns. Anyway, does that...
Actually, that reminds me of The Hero's Journey by Joseph Campbell.
Yeah.
And I think maybe we'll get into some of the stuff you've been doing recently after, maybe towards the next part. But the Hero's Journey is 6 parts or 4 parts. It depends who's reading it. But from my memory, here we go, is you hear the call. There's something that you feel you're meant to do, maybe on a soul level or a pattern level. You leave home. You face trials and obstacles, and you want to go home. You want to give up. You want to return to mom. You want to return to the motherland, whatever it is, and just say, screw this, let me just fit in. I want to just fit in. I'm sick of this. This is insane. And then through suffering, through, I think Hillman says something like the soul is open through our wounds. Through some terrible, usually, descent, either psychological, spiritual, or physical, or maybe it's conquering, in the old days, the dragon or whatever. Maybe the dragon's in us, or the dragon is that we demonize other people. Then we receive the gift or the tool, and we now, whatever that gift or tool is, we can now wield that. And we're learning to wield it, I suppose. We're not totally competent yet. And then this is the 4-part path. Eventually, we learn that we can't use our tool or our gift for only selfish reasons. So we've got to return home in a way, not necessarily to our homeland, but in a way that is sharing our gift and sharing what we've learned and through our journey with younger people or other people that are in need. And that the hero's journey is what Joseph Campbell kind of distilled out of reading so many mythic tales about great spiritual heroes, great mythic figures, and he sort of came up with the 4-part. Now, it's way more complex if you read his books. I just summarized. I think it's actually
That's
6
a great
or 8
summary.
parts.
Nice job.
But that was, So I feel like even that is a story. I remember using that in therapy with a young person, and how they felt like they were being labeled, and because they had left the conformity of their family, and their family had very strict rules, and they were all unwritten, but it was he knew what the rules were, because if he didn't follow them, there was massive shame over things that I was bewildered by, really. Like he didn't. I won't get into detail for HIPAA reasons, but he left, and it was almost like being excommunicated, I suppose. And he was a very successful person in terms of our culture. And then eventually, I don't remember the whole story because he left therapy, but he did receive some sort of gift. He had a fantastic talent and became successful in a completely different realm than it was expected of him by his family and by his culture of origin. And last I heard, he was attempting to return to community in some way. I don't think it was around his family because they couldn't hear him, sort of like Francis of Assisi's father totally disowns him. I think that's kind of where he was at that point. Yeah. But I remember that's when I brought it up because I had been reading Campbell, and I used that 4-part thing, and he felt so much better knowing that other people and other cultures and the history, like this is actually a pattern. Like you're not just an outcast. You're not just, I don't know, whatever he was labeling himself as or being labeled as by others. And so I don't know. I don't know. I think of that. I like to put myself in that. It's an interesting container with which we can help make sense of traumatic things, but that's not totally to the descent part, but anyway.
Yeah. Well, it's nice because in a simple way, it says there's an aim to all this. And you can at any point be in a sort of state of arrested development. You could be in the descent and never return. Or you could have a gift and use it for selfish reasons. Or you could refuse the call. That's one of the,
oh, sure.
They're
Stay
all
home.
But to say that the aim ultimately is to live in service, to offer the gift of who you are to the world, is noble. And I think that's what, in a really simple way, that story is not being told culturally. Think about even the office of the president. I imagine 100 years ago, I'm making this up, there was still enough nobility that what was the purpose of it? To serve the greatest good to the greatest number of people. And now politics has become just an ideological power grab, and they talk about public service, but we could probably count on one hand the number of people who are in politics that we would say that person really seems like they're giving their gift to the world to do the greatest amount of good. We say, no, that we can't find it anywhere. It's not a story that is being told. And I think that's part of maybe a larger cultural disillusionment. Like, we look around and say hardly anybody is living in a sacrificially profound way. And yet we have this like deep kind of pattern in the psyche that says that that's the aim. And so like this, this person in therapy that you brought up, to find something of that is to find meaning. It's to find the meaning of one's own life. So I don't know where I would go from there, other than that's partly why I'm saying we still need the stories. We need the stories for the patterns that they reveal. And that's not the only one, the hero's journey. In fact, maybe it's a little overused at present. We have actually like a lot of, quote, heroes, maybe that's probably not the best word anymore. You also have the life cycle of things. Like I was thinking about Women Who Run with the Wolves, that book. That's a very different, the stories in there are mythically different patterns. There are some hero components to it, but much more about the life cycle of all things. Maybe that's more of the feminine counterpart to the hero that goes out and does something.
That's a good point. That's a very masculine story, if you kind of break it down.
Yeah, it is a very masculine story. But anyway, we need these kind of deeper streams, and Disney. The reason why Disney is a multi-billion-dollar company is because they're playing with these myths.
Oh yeah,
they're playing with the archetypes, and probably intentionally. I don't know anyone that works there, but that's why they work, because it's waking up the patterns that are in us, I think.
Yeah. Well, speaking of archetypes, lately you had told me about the work of Dr. Bill Plotkin, and I started reading his book Soulcraft, which I'm very much enjoying right now. And I was just kind of curious about what was your own experience like with sort of doing some of that work, or some deep soul-searching work with the archetypes.
Yeah, it's a good question. I sort of told you that he came into my field of vision through Richard Rohr, and I started reading some of his books. But what was waking up was in me was a desire to go on some of these programs. Like I wanted to someday do a vision fast, and I liked the way he talked about it, because it didn't seem like cultural appropriation. It seemed like a contemporary form of something very ancient. That was kind of the pull, but I was also really terrified of it. Like, terrified in an existential way and also a physical way, like what would happen to me. So I sort of crept into some of their programs there. I started with a program called Wild Mind, which maybe was a way, it's sort of a map of archetypes of wholeness and the subpersonalities of these of the map based on the 4 cardinal directions. And first of all, it was pretty concrete. I could go into details if you want, but I don't need to. It worked for me, like I could understand it. But the amazing thing about the program is we'd be talking about the North, for example, and the archetype is the nurturing, generative adult, and we would engage in practices, be sent out onto the land, and this was in high in the mountains of New Mexico. And I just felt like relieved and also a little bit scared at the same time. I grew up in the woods in Virginia, where I was born. And I always really loved being outside. And I kind of had maybe lost touch with this the more natural Kent, whatever that is. And there was something about the way the practices and ceremonies and invitations that really just rung my bell. I was like, yes, I want to be outside. And a lot of the practices are designed in such a way to enhance the conversation between the unconscious or the soul, the psyche, and the natural world. The natural world as a mirror to one's own depths. And that really, I think, resonated with me and challenged me at the same time. And I remember on that first program, they said, well, we want to do some dream work in the morning. And I thought to myself, well, I don't really have dreams, or if I do, I don't really remember them, or I can remember a couple from childhood, but a lot different than my wife, who was always, saying, hey, I had this dream. And so I just followed their basic instructions, like, okay, well, I'll take a notebook out, and if I remember some, I'll write them down. So I came to breakfast in the morning, and we sat down at a table, and they said, who had any dreams? And nobody said anything. And I was like, well, I guess I did. And they said, okay, why don't you begin to share your dream? And there's some instructions for how to do that. And I tried to choose one that I thought was the least potent, I didn't know because I'd never done any dream work, but I was like, this one seems mild, this one seems weird and probably doesn't mean anything, is kind of maybe what my ego was saying. Right. And as soon as I got into it, within a matter of just a few minutes, I found myself sort of re-experiencing the dream in a profound way. And I'm crying at breakfast, and the dream, in a way, through the course of the next few days, just really shook me to the core. Like, wait a minute, who the hell am I? What is this thing? What is the invitation? What are these emotions, feelings, and images that I seem to know nothing about, that also seem to have a kind of potency and edge to them in inviting me into something? And that, in a way, it changed my life, because I realized, first of all, I don't know what I'm talking about, which is a great, probably once a year we need a good, right. Once a week might be better, but at least once a year we need to be reminded, wait, I don't know what I'm talking about. And all my theology and spirituality, I don't know anything. And I guess for some people that can be completely demoralizing. For me, it was like, all right, I want to keep going on this journey. And so it changed my life in that sense. And just a single dream. And I still carry some of the images with that dream. I think now that I know a little bit about dream work, and only a little bit, I suppose there are big dreams and small dreams. If I could guess, maybe they're all big, but this one strikes me as one of the big ones that I'll continue to wrestle with the rest of my life. So anyway, that sort of shifted my way of being in the world, and then I was like, all right, I'm going to do more of these. There's something about the relationship between soul and nature that I resonate with. And initially, I was, or I should say simultaneously with this first program, was when I started having those rumblings of, what am I doing with my life? I can't believe I'm a pastor. How did I ever end up doing this? I had a couple of, I wrote about it in Bitten by Campbell, but I had kind of an out-of-body experience when I was teaching one time. I was walking around on the stage, and I could see myself talking from above in a way, and my feeling was, I don't know what that guy is talking about. Maybe it was just an encounter with this persona or something but it was definitely, it scared me. Like, it was like, whoa, what's going on? So I'm mentioning that because this program coincided with these the questions of, what am I doing with my life, and who am I, and what is my purpose, and I began to have like kind of strange experiences like that I couldn't easily make sense of. And then I joined at Animas. They had a year-long program. I was like, I'm going to do this year-long program. And 2 days before it started, I quit my job as a pastor. Oh, wow. And again, this was not like a plan of mine. It just all kind of like, it felt haphazard. Like I could tell a great story about it now. Sure. But then it just felt like, I'm done. Joseph Campbell had something to do with it. My wife was reminding me the other day. I finished watching the Joseph Campbell videos, the Bill Moyers and Joseph Campbell videos for the second time.
Yes.
And she said a few days after that, I said I'm done being a mega church pastor. So that was in the mix too. And I went into this program really open in a way, and really feeling the terror of not having a plan. Like this was not a plan B. I didn't have a plan B. I didn't have a strategy for even how to quit my job. I have kids, I have a house, I didn't even know how I was going to pay the bills. So I was feeling that. And at the same time, just on a maybe deeper, more existential sense, I don't know where I'm going. And I want to keep going. I want to keep going down. And that's the way it felt. My dad died that same year during my year-long program, and that was just a continued push into this, into the deep questions of who am I and what am I doing here? But eventually, when I emerged up out of the year-long, and it's not like it manufactures sort of a soul descent. Mm-hmm. And Animist is quite clear about this. They're not trying to manufacture anything. There's an application process. And I think they tend to accept people who, in a program like the year-long, that already are in various stages of descent, have broken in some ways, the strings of conformity. And I don't mean they're rebels. I just mean like they're trying to choose authenticity over social acceptance, would be one way of putting it. And they're having a hard time finding their way. And they've begun the descent, I suppose. It's happening to them. So anyway, at the end of this program, there was something about it that I wanted to keep going. And I wasn't sure how, and it took me a while to decide, but eventually I applied to their apprenticeship program, which is, in a way, I'm apprenticing to do this kind of work, nature-based guiding, yes. Nature-based underworld guiding, we might call it. But it is a real apprenticeship in that it's a long, slow process. And it's mostly through programs. There's not really a curriculum. And Animist has about 12 to 15 guides, so I'm learning from all these people. It's not just like Bill Plotkin is the guru and we all sit at his feet. It's not like that.
Right.
And a lot of it is trial by fire, meaning we are expected to be full participants in all these various programs, to have the work be done unto us before we ever get to the point of how might I turn this around in some way. And so every time I go in a program, I'm always like, oh God, what now? What dream might I have, or what sort of strange and numinous experience might happen, or maybe nothing will happen, and that will be, because that often is the case too, So anyway, that's kind of how I backed into this, or fell into this kind of work. But I do think about it as a kind of calling. My evangelical hang-ups resist words like that at times, because that's the way Christians talk about stuff, and God told me to do this and I'm called. But it does feel like a calling in the deep, like a calling of the soul, that to be in this kind of work, that the transition from the first half of life to the second half of life, and even discovering any elements of the deeper self, is really hard and treacherous terrain. But people need help in that respect. And so I don't know, that was kind of a long rambling of how I got into this kind of stuff. What are you hearing?
Oh, I like all of it. I heard some things, and I kind of want to hear more.
All right.
About when you had that dream. There just sounded like multiple initiations, and that's from the Jungian depth psychology language. It just sounded like you were being, like initiation, I guess, is a calling. Like all of a sudden something comes from beneath, and the earth is beneath us, and we're part of nature. And that's something I struggle with in our culture a lot, is just people talk about the earth and nature as if it's something separate or something out there or something disposable. And so just kind of recognizing we're part of nature, then this initiation came up. All of a sudden, you kind of, like when initiation happens, at first, I think sometimes people get excited. They're like, oh, good, more transformation and transcendence. And what happened all of a sudden, here, I quit my job. I entered some program that doesn't have a prescriptive outcome. And I was thinking about soul work and the depth psychology is that they're into healing in whatever form that comes into from the Jungian stuff. I'm not sure about Plotkin, and that's not necessarily symptom relief or feeling like you might go through a depression or anxiety and you're trying to get to, I feel like, I don't know, an acceptance of self, an acceptance of mortality, an acceptance of where we live on a planet in a solar system, an acceptance of a greater cosmology. I don't know if Plotkin's going there, but that's what I'm hearing. Reminding me a little bit of, like, it's nature-based. So learning from, so we talk about stories, but learning from the way trees grow and the way the seasons pass in different areas of the world, and learning from weather transitions and, I don't know, rocks that have been there for, we're
That's
obviously reflecting our thoughts onto the rocks. I like all of it because it's another way, it's a tool, but it's another way. I think people are really looking for something deeper and greater. I think in the second part of life, especially, if we just keep reading the same story over and over and over, it feels rote and it feels, well, I guess this is all there is, and I'm just going to sink into my habits.
Yeah.
And I think that people don't really want to do that, but I feel like sometimes people don't think there's another option. Because, it's interesting, you're talking about your descent and going into this and what's going on and what am I going to be challenged with now? I can hear people going, why would I ever want to do this?
I know.
Why would I ever want to expose myself to more challenges? And I don't know why you do it, but I know I've been dabbling. I haven't gone full into his program or anything like that, but I've been doing some nature-based stuff as well, just in very, like, what do you call that? Small doses, I suppose, for sessions and different things in addition. And I've been learning just so much about my own inner self, even from like a therapy lens too, just going, oh, I'm doing this action. I may believe all these great things like we talked about earlier, and I may have all these great therapeutic answers for certain symptoms, but what am I on an underneath level doing? And I think the nature-based stuff is helping me sort of encounter a different part of myself that is causing actual, like you can ask my wife, actual change, like versus just like, micro changes. Like as you said, the work is slow and grueling, but even though it's slow and it may be subtle, I felt doing a small dose of what you've been doing, I felt just amazing. I felt more united with myself, but also the world, also other people, also accepting of people whose normally I would have been reactive to their belief system and reactive to their behavior. And I found myself, I don't know, trying to be at peace with it. So I guess I'm reflecting my own thing, and it reminded me, the last thing I'll say, because I want to hear more about you and what you're doing and some of these things and how people can get involved. It reminded me of, I went and saw Matthew Fox. I don't know if you know who he is, but he was talking at the Jung Institute in Chicago in the fall, and he was just really interesting guy. But one of the things what struck me was that he was helping a lot of former Catholics get involved in something called the Cosmic Mass. And the Cosmic Mass is essentially a ceremony for anyone from any spiritual or non-spiritual tradition to show up. And I don't know, he goes through all these stages. I don't know exactly, but sort of like recognizing our humanity, recognizing our grief, recognizing our hopes and dreams, but also recognizing our death and demise, and recognizing that we're part of a larger cosmology. And he showed us some photographs and some videos, and also just talking about it and how people from all faiths and also a ton of atheists that came to the one in Toronto were just crying and just sort of joining hands, people from all backgrounds. And in his words, he's trying to invent a new story. Like if we're part of a larger cosmology, is that a new story we can adopt? That's kind of one of his things, which is not, I don't think what Plotkin's doing, but...
No, not necessarily, although sometimes Plotkin will reference other people who are doing that kind of stuff, like Thomas Berry.
Oh, okay. Right.
Thomas Berry, I think, Brian Swim. These are kind of the new new cosmologists in a way. But I love what you're saying. I mean, I think spirituality in general, if it doesn't find its way back to a deeper relationship with the earth, then we're in real trouble. I mean, and if people aren't rediscovering their kinship with the world, then we continue to destroy what we're made of. You know, like you're right, we are our nature. We don't realize everything that we're doing to the earth, we're doing to ourselves, or we're barely beginning to realize that. So spirituality has to be a kind of return to this reciprocal, cooperative dance. But one of the things I think that's surprising about nature-based work is that some people, if I describe kind of what I do and maybe take people out on retreats, they sort of imagine that they're going to go out there and they're going to be one with nature.
Oh, right.
You know, or they're going to pick wild berries and just return to like the indigenous cave woman or caveman. That's not what really happens at all. Sometimes you can experience moments of what I would, I guess, call transcendence or union, or you realize that this decomposing stump is somehow mystically also what I am. Right. And I will return to the earth, and I am already returning to the earth in the very same way. But that's maybe a flash, a taste that you might get from time to time. But nature, it pushes against us also. That's what's surprising about it. Like, there's a practice we sometimes do at Animist called befriending the dark. And I won't go through all the steps, but we basically are encouraging people to go out at night to seek out a place in which they can feel some terror. And if it's not terrifying enough, to go further. Now, you need people who are psychologically well enough to and also, you can't force this kind of stuff on anyone. But what I mean is that when you're out there, on the one hand, you have elements of your own psyche that are attacking you. You know, your nature is a mirror like that, and the tree is the bear, and the bear is, part of this archetypal thing that you're deeply afraid of, and it's part of your own shadow. And so, but also, it's also terrifying to be outside. Nature just by itself isn't exactly our friend, Right. And that's why I love nature-based work, because you can send people out on to do ceremonies and practices, and I can never predict there are patterns, but I can never predict what's going to happen. It could be that they begin a conversation with a tree that opens up something deep about who they are. They could also just be really cold, and it right. could rain, and they could be worried about their own survival. And that's the thing that happens, It's so it's I guess in a simple sense, you're handing over a lot of the work to nature itself, and you become a kind of process guide to help people talk more deeply about their experiences. You can't manufacture anything. If you send someone on a vision fast, all you can say is, "I'll see you in 4 days, don't eat." That's all you can say. And what happens out there, you can't predict. You don't know. There are patterns because we're human beings. And the great myths seem to say these are the sorts of things that will happen, but you don't know. And the wild individual content is going to just come however it's going to come. And then in a way, you're responsible for helping people integrate, process, and work through what comes out in this surprising exchange between the soul and nature. And I guess a lot of the programs are designed like that. How do we encourage and enhance conversation, the great conversation between nature and the human soul? If that makes some sense.
I love that. I definitely at the end I want to make sure we put Plotkin's work and the Animist Institute in the notes. Okay. So more people can be getting into this, and it just so much there. But a couple of things that just struck me from the therapy angle were just sort of from the psychological world that I'm in, is that I found that people seem to get more out of what I would call experiential therapy than just a belief substitution or some sort of mechanism you memorize. So I do EMDR therapy, which is about getting into the experience of the felt sense of the emotions and processing that, but it's much more controlled. And I fear what's going on in the nature-based is you are letting go of a lot of control. Not total control, because you have a sleeping bag and maybe some emergency rations or something to eat if you actually pass out or whatever from not eating, and you have some guides and some structure. But nature is scary, and it does push against us. It can bring up all sorts of feelings and thoughts because you're alone with your own thoughts. But it's very much the opposite of a self-development seminar that brings you through 3 days.
No kidding.
Like, well, the first day we're going to do this, and the second day we're going to do this, and the third day, then you'll know, and wait, come back next year, and also maybe sell this MLM thing. So, I mean, it's if a person's going to do it, they've got to understand what you learn or don't learn could be transformative. But you're taking a risk because it's not packaged in a neat little bow, and the only thing I can think of on the way to what you're talking about is sometimes I've had some friends, I haven't done one yet, but go on silent retreats where you are quiet for 3 days among other people, which is interesting, and you can eat some food, and maybe there'll be a speaker for like an hour a day, and you go walk in nature and do like meditative walking and things, and usually that has the great effect of reducing stress and maybe learning a few things about what your thought content's about and going through some exercises. But what I hear you doing is, I think I'm very excited about this because it's like, all right, let's just get out there. This is way more than a controlled vegan silent retreat in our little hut, in our comfortable blankets. And we're going out into nature. And I mean, that's how, I don't know. I think it was easier to learn from nature when we used to live more in it. Now it's very controlled. My street has trees planted by the city right there on the boulevard, and they're nicely spaced, and I can have a certain amount of foliage around here, but this is a house in a neighborhood, and eventually, if I put up too many bushes, I think someone might complain. Yeah. So, I mean, this is a controlled environment, and some deer sometimes get up here, and but that's not too scary. You're going out there, we're letting go of control, and I think letting go of control in therapy helps us process unprocessed things and emotions. So I can only imagine letting go of control of safety and letting go of control of what I'm supposed to learn and letting go of control of who I think I am and letting go of control and just having a few parameters to what one might learn. It can be completely seismic in its shift.
Yeah,
but go ahead.
It is very much about letting go of enough control. I mean, the ego never totally goes away. I remember even at the very end of my 4-day vision fast, in my head, all of a sudden I realized I was working on my CV, my resume, for a long time. Here I am at the end of, you'd think I'd be in some mystical union with nature, and, no, I'm working on my CV. It's just turning over. Well, maybe I could, I need to do this, this, and this, and maybe I could apply for this. I'm like already preparing to exit, or I guess I'm exiting already mentally. But you're right. Being in wild or semi-wild places, it's humbling. It's always humbling, and we need more of that. And I think that the soul longs for that kind of humiliation might even be the right word, that you're not in control of your life. You're not even in control of you didn't even have any say in coming into this strange world in the first place. So here I am in the earth community, in these wild places, in these mysterious and wild places. How did we get here? And you realize how little control you really have, and the invitation to go deeper it creates kind of a thin place, a thin place between who I think I or who I thought I was in the world and what's beneath that. And same with the world, what I thought the world was and what's behind that, you know? And those thin places are often experienced in wild and semi-wild places. Same with probably a silent retreat. I am the one who walks around and says things. Well, when you're not walking around saying things, the world becomes more thin. And all these other ways of being in the world, and even our own senses, start having a say. And our imagination starts having a say, and our hearing starts having a say, and being in communion with someone without speech, it's like a whole foreign way of being in the world. And again, that's another thin place. And the thin places are the perhaps the places where transformation, it's the edge of some potential transformation. So, yeah. And I think, first of all, I can easily become the kind of person that one of my professors in graduate school used to say, what was the line? We all tend to universalize what life has done to us. So, which is a nice way of saying, like, well, my example would be, hey, I'm into nature-based stuff. Everyone should be, you know, or everybody needs to go on a vision fast, or I don't have that. The more rational side of me says, no, it's not for everyone. Nature is for everyone because we are nature. But there are a lot more simple practices and sort of 101 type things to help awaken the conversation between nature and the human soul, rather than a vision fast, you know, going on a walk, going to a park and allowing yourself to be drawn to a place. Well, what does that mean? Well, go and do it. Go and say, and just walk around, open up to your five senses and follow your curiosity. And if suddenly a place kind of intrigues you, a spot out on the land, go and spend time there. Go and engage in a kind of living conversation. Talk to birds. I mean, St. Francis did it, you know, open your mouth to and have a dialogue with a tree. There's no trick involved. It's not magic. It just re-engages or maybe on one sense, it confuses our ego. And it says that the ego sort of says, I don't know what this is, but if you can get beyond that, then you find yourself having an exchange. I was about to bring up something about dancing, because one time I was having I was working with a guide basically, and she said something like, why don't you go out and find a place on the land that you're attracted to and dance or move the way that you're feeling. And I went and tried it, and it's like, what is happening? As if part of me knows what to do, and part of me knows nothing about that, right. You know? And you're like, wait, what kind of world? So these are just simple ways of engaging this ancient human conversation between who our deep selves are and the world that we find ourselves in. So I love that you actually brought in the practical aspects for people that maybe not in a position to go do something like this. But there's various levels, from the basic going to a park to seeing a depth psychologist or somebody who knows and engaging in those conversations, to reading books, to journaling, to outside, you know, mm-hmm. obviously things that would engage you with nature and the nature-based work, to obviously the extreme getting into it. But it reminded me a couple things. Just on a base level, it can help you because we're part of nature. When I lived in Chicago, I used to call it city fever. Mm-hmm. Every 3 or 4 weeks, I just felt like so much inundation with the stress of the city that I would take the train up to Evanston and go take the bus to the botanical gardens or go to the lake to just get away from the noise. And so that can be just helpful on a basic level, but to engage in the deep conversation, it takes a little bit more. It takes a practice, I guess, a little bit of a practice. And I think when you start talking to a tree or going around and just experimenting with your body, like stretching in a park or dancing or just examining like, for instance, I don't know if this is one of your practices, but I've called it like
when you just sit somewhere and like when you were a kid and you just sort of examine the soil and examine the grass and then kind of look at the clouds and sort of like make up a story about the clouds. I don't know what you'd call that, but what this is a disorientation to our normal pattern.
Yeah.
Our normal autopilot pattern of whatever you're engaged in right now, school, work, maybe you don't work, maybe, whatever family situation, whatever it is, you're in a pattern of some type. And maybe you break up the pattern by, prototypical, if you can afford to go on a vacation, you break up the pattern, or you go to a movie, that breaks up the pattern. But if you allow yourself to engage with nature, it's basically free, and it's what I call, it's a disorientation to the pattern of your mind, so that you can listen.
Yeah.
In psychological interpretation, without going into the Jungian part, is just you're listening to what's going on inside of you, and you're lowering your defenses to whatever narrative you think you're living out. And it can be simple, such as just so simple, like going on a walk and not taking your headphones, and all of a sudden going, you know what? My friend, they said something to me and it hurt my feelings, and I need to go to them. So simple, relational, or deeper. Why am I working at this place? I don't like anything about it. I've been lying to myself. I've been seeking security over authenticity. Or why am I in this relationship? Or what am I doing with my life? Which is scary, but also, if you don't do it, go read The Regrets of the Dying. Like people, I don't know if I can't remember the 5, but one of them is that they wish they had sort of listened to their dream of what they wanted to do, and that, I think the dream is bringing your gift into the world. That's one way of having a dream, and engaging with it. Not that that's the only way to engage with it. That's my little interpretation of it. So these practices are, and they're also, I think, ancient practices also. So that it's uniting to something from the past.
Yeah, for sure. It's hard to trace the origin of any practice, because religions tend to share material and practices that work. And the various forms of prayer. But I think on one level, we're describing a more contemplative way of bringing yourself to the world, where a nice way of putting it is what you just said. You're breaking your ordinary patterns. And that's what practices were meant to do. That's what the disciplines were meant to do. The idea of a vision fast, Jesus did, in the Christian tradition. That's how he started his whole, he wouldn't, from a historical point of view, I am imagining, if he doesn't go on a vision fast, then he doesn't know what his aim is. He doesn't know, he comes up out of the wilderness and starts talking about the kingdom of God. And, well, how did he experience this? Facing that sort of Satan-like shadow that's coming up in the wilderness is what happens when you're out there on a vision fast. You can't hide from both your glory and your darkness. You cannot hide from it. And if you don't begin a deep and profound relationship with your darkness and your gold, if you want to look at it that way, the gift you have and the shadow elements of that, then you don't know who you are, and you probably won't have something like an aim, like I'm here to, like Jesus, preach the kingdom of God or whatever. So it's like, you say I'm going on a vision fast. People think, aren't you just like taking a Lakota practice and, pretending to be, put a feather in your hair? And no, not really. Although the Lakota, there's much to learn from their very ancient form of the vision fast, but it's transcultural, is my point is. And they're ancient. They're absolutely ancient. A silent retreat is about as ancient as you can get. But we think, contemporary people think they're so sophisticated, myself included, that I don't need any of that old crap. Can't I just Google what I need? No, you can't. You cannot Google what you need. You can Google information, but you don't need information. So anyway, I'm getting a little bit fired up, but
I like that. I just want to throw in one comment, which is when you said like the glory and the darkness. The darkness. I was just thinking of, if you don't know psychologically the grandiosity of what you're capable of and dealing with your high part of your ego and what you really think you want and your shadow, then you're going to have you're going to have a breakdown anyway, but you're going to have a lot of problems.
Yeah.
And there's a quote that I'm going to butcher, so bear with me, but I think it's a Jung quote, which is something about what we don't discover in ourselves comes to us as fate in the outside world.
Yeah.
So just on a pure sense, you can't Google your way out of it.
Yeah.
Like you can Google anything and you have information. We're swimming in information. We're in an information overload. But let's just say you find what you think is good information. That's great. Can you apply it?
Yeah.
And to apply it, my personal opinion and what I'm getting from some of this nature-based work is there's got to be more work on your past. There's got to be more work on your story. And there's got to be work with what is going on now in my psyche, in the deep waters. And also just doing these practices can bring up the answer. In psychotherapy all the time, I get questions, what should I do about this or that? And I usually just pause and smile, and then they get annoyed because they know the answer, at least at that moment, that seems right in their intuition. But their mind, and so then a lot of times I'll say, well, don't even answer that. Why don't take some time, go out, and don't even ponder that question for a while. Put that on the shelf and see what comes to you. Because, I'm getting into answers now, but which I was trying not to do. But I guess, sometimes it's about the soul, but also sometimes it's about our circumstances, and our soul is reacting to the circumstances. And sometimes we do have to change our circumstances. But it can be...
I think midlife, concerning circumstances and soul, I think midlife as a kind of metaphor is the soul coming in and saying, change your life.
Yeah.
Have you ever read that Rilke poem where he's describing the head of Apollo or something? It's like a very detailed description of the head of this Greek god, like the contours and the colors, and as if he's staring at a statue.
Right.
But the very last line is change your life. Like part of that is when you experience the wonder and the awe of anything at all, something cuts through and says, what are you doing with your life?
Right.
It's like, I remember I went to Wealthy Street Theater, which is a theater in town, to see the Sigor Ros film. And Sigor Ros, this Icelandic band, and they have this film, and they're basically just going around playing their music in Iceland, and there are all these nature shots. It's amazing, but it cut through me like an arrow, which was something like, change your life. Do something meaningful, damn it. And that's the soul waking up. But the same can be true, I think, also in like troubling circumstances. Why was I up there on stage giving probably a really good sermon? I'm sure that was filled with good ideas.
Sure.
And yet I was experiencing this out-of-body, who is that guy talking right now? That's the soul, like lining up an arrow, running it straight through my life, saying, time to change your life, and it's going to hurt, and suffering is going to come, or like we could think about cliche examples like the accountant who all of a sudden his whole life has been buttoned up in such a significant and tight way. All of a sudden, one weekend in Las Vegas, and he blows his 401k, And people think, oh, what a disaster. He should put his life back together and apologize to his family. And the soul is saying something like, what the hell are you doing? Who are you? And that's the unassimilated shadow, All this buttoning up was the inability to go to the wilderness and meet Satan, to use the sort of Jesus archetype of going into the wilderness, going in and facing what are the shadow qualities of my own life that I refuse to even look at. But I feel like midlife is like the last chance, when people tell me I don't know what I believe anymore, I think, thank God,
Right.
or I'm struggling in my marriage. Well, if you're not, then there's a problem, And so on the one hand, I'm not celebrating people's suffering. And there's a lot of unnecessary suffering in the world, but, it's also a great invitation.
Yeah, so we're talking about suffering with meaning. We're not talking about people being persecuted on the border. We're talking about a person who has, I guess, luxury and some structure to their life that maybe people 100 years ago couldn't even dream of, and conveniences. And are we waking up to? I also heard, am I waking up to my full humanness? Mm-hmm. If I'm going out to the desert for 40 days, and I'm being tempted by the grandiosity, but also being maybe even slightly scared or whatever of the darkness, I can embrace myself, and I can embrace the shadow, or my longing towards doing something that isn't in alignment with me or helping people around me or whatever it is. So if we're embracing our full human nature, then the pain of the circumstantial change, or the pain of the difficult conversation, or the pain of the career change, or the downsizing of whatever possessions you have, pales in comparison to the meaning. And that brings us back to people are meaning-seeking creatures.
Yeah.
And we seek meaning, and we were talking about the nature-based stuff because that's a way to get meaning, deep meaning, from varied, interesting things that are growing on this planet.
Yeah.
And I feel like there's some interesting meaning in architecture sometimes. And there's probably a whole bunch of stuff written on that. But when I drive around the city and look at the houses that all look similar, and I don't really feel a deep connection with that on a soul level. But and so we're seeking something richer and deeper, and then it's about, and then there's I don't know. It's not as if all of a sudden you reach wholeness. That's not what I'm trying to say.
Right.
I'm trying to say that you realize that we're doing work. We're doing our inner work, and if you're doing your inner work, then life doesn't necessarily go great, but you can be in alignment and feel some sense of, I don't know, purpose, some sense of meaning, some sense of that you can sleep at night without drugs, not necessarily, but that, I
know what you mean. Yeah. There's like a sense where there's enough meaning that it makes the suffering noble in a way.
Right.
Or, and I'm not here trying to justify people's unnecessary suffering in the world, but life is suffering. That's Buddhism. That's the first tenet. And that's something hard to face, and we are mortal. We're going to die. I remember one practice we did at Animus called the Death Lodge, and I actually made one in I have a little bit of land, so I made a little lodge, and the practice, I won't describe the whole thing, but the simple practice is to go out and imagine you're going to die, and what needs to get cleaned up. And I, in my sort of imagination, I invited people into my death lodge that I needed to have conversations with. Not worrying about, do I actually need to have these conversations with these people, but what do I need to say? It's a way of facing the great call of meaning. Because, and my dad also happened to be dying during this time period, so it felt like a really rich practice. Like, my dad is dying, which is a way every day, when you look at someone that's dying, you're seeing your own mortality. You're seeing this what we all share in common, and that's going to happen to me, and it's happening already. So change your life. Don't go back to sleep. Whatever you do, don't go back to sleep. And it sounds so morbid. It's so like anti-American. Like, hey, you need to go out and make a death lodge and contemplate your own mortality, and imagine if you were to die tomorrow, how would you want to live? What needs to get put in order? Do you want to leave someone with the mess of your own life, or do you want to put your life in order and take responsibility? And as soon as you're asking those kinds of questions, I think you're dabbling in the meaning. You're getting close to the meaning of your own life, and maybe the meaning of life, period.
I like that. I can't remember the quote, but something about, there's some philosopher that said he keeps death in mind so that he might live. I can't remember who said that.
Yeah, or actually, there's a famous statue of Jerome. He's Saint Jerome. He is the one that translated the Bible from the the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Bible, to Latin.
Okay.
And the sculptures of him, it must be some story, I don't know that much about Jerome, but have him holding a skull in one hand and a pen in the other.
Oh.
You know?
Wow.
What an image.
Yeah.
You know? What an image. I am going to die. What is my life worth? I'm dust. I'm a single cloud passing over the vast desert, you know?
Right.
And yet I have this pen in my hand. And what am I going to do with it, you know? I mean, this is someone that shaped Western culture, all of Western culture, by translating the Bible from Greek to Latin.
Wow.
For good and bad. I mean, we don't need to get into all that, but I'm just saying, yeah, he picked up the pen, and part of that was because he has faced his own mortality. Right. I am going to die. And it wasn't this pie in the sky, well, I'm going to be in heaven with God, walking around and chilling, you know? No, he was looking into the face of death. And anyway, so, yeah, and maybe, you know, that's not something you need to tell an 8-year-old. Here's a skull, you know.
Well,
Hey,
that's
kids.
the first part of life.
Yeah,
we
exactly.
still have to develop a healthy ego. So let's go.
right.
So remember, for parents out there, we're not recommending this for children under 18. But anyway, but yeah, go ahead.
No, I mean, that's just it. I think that's part of, sometimes like, I was just doing some traveling for spring break and I saw these motorcycles pass me like at 140 miles an hour. And one of them, I'm making up the miles an hour. It was a fast and I was going fast. And one of them had on one of those camouflage backpacks, you know, like from the Army. And I was thinking about this. My brother is also in the Army. And when you come back from the Army, it's like you can never really again get that close to mortality in such a concentrated fashion, like warfare, you know? I mean, on one hand, even though it's debilitating, and it was for my brother to be in these, you know, in Iraq, it's also exhilarating and forces you to face the fragility of your own life, and you see death around you all the time. And so what do you do when you come back, you know? Watch, you know, 30 Rock, you know?
Right.
I mean, that's entertaining, but so anyway, I'm bringing this up to say that to go on a motorcycle at 140 miles an hour seems like a crazy thing unless you have tasted something even more, you know, dangerous in a way. Anyway, why am I bringing that up? Because people of that age are in that transitional time period from growing up with the structures of childhood, and all of a sudden they're bumping into mortality and the meaning of life, and they're right on the edge. And young people are struggling so much because we live in such a narcissistic and nihilistic world, and sometimes it's like, you know, can you swear on your podcast? You know,
Sure, go for it.
He's like, you know, it's like, fuck it. I'm just going to go 140 miles an hour because I don't even know what's meaningful anymore. And I was lied to in the Army, you know, and also it provided some meaning. It's always that mixed, you know, camaraderie and meaning, and you want to fight for something noble. And some of this seems like a lie, you know, and you don't know what to do with this anymore. And, yeah, which is why people need people like you in the world to say, all right, let's take the dangerous path toward holding that skull and finding the pen. Let's take the dangerous path instead of symptom management, you know, which sometimes you need. Like, I'm not against drugs. If people are really struggling, get some freaking drugs.
Right.
So you can get healthy enough to hold the skull in one hand and find the pen, you know? Not to turn this into like,
but you just triaged very well. Yes.
Yeah.
If to do this, some people, you know, are in an unstable mental state. So if you are, please get help immediately. And then you can go on. And then when you feel like, you don't have to be stable, but when you get to a point where you're not at risk, then indulging in the dialogue about what am I going to do with my time?
Yeah.
And what actions am I going to take?
Yeah. Think about what the world could do with someone who was unafraid to go 140 miles an hour and do a wheelie on the highway. What could the world do if that kind of capacity to face danger was put toward more noble, meaningful, and enriching possibilities, you know? We need more people like that. Not reckless people, but I don't know, like who have found some courage but are putting it toward the most meaningful things in life, you know?
Who are taking an alternate path. You were talking about young people, and I'm all the time faced with the disillusionment of young people in my practice and their parents, but we'll go with the young people, which is all of a sudden they're 18 or 23 and they're graduated college, and the parents say, well, here's the path. It's getting more competitive out there, which means that to get those good jobs, to get you a good house, to get you a good education, to make you marketable, whatever, to get a good car, to have a good partner, you've got to do this, and this, and very structured, very concrete, very rigid. Okay. And the young person going, what the hell? Mm-hmm. First of all, I went through all this school, which is super rigid. And then I went to college, which is semi-rigid, though it depends what college you go to. And then, there's structure there. And now I want to explore like who I want to be. And you're telling me I don't have time. Mm-hmm. You're telling me I'm 23 and I don't have time to figure out who I am because I need to hurry up because other people are investing in real estate and other people are becoming accountants and I'm going to be left behind economically or whatever. Yeah. And so then it almost seems like an extreme. And it is sort of an extreme between choosing a safe path to whatever their culture or their parents or whatever television is telling them or the internet, and choosing almost a very risky path. Mm-hmm. And I think some of the work that you're talking about in the nature base and what I'm trying to do in therapy is hold on to the opposites. Yes, there's that tension for sure, but where can you find your unique way of dealing with this problem? Because this is a problem. Yeah. This is something that is it is going to ruin your soul if you just pick one blindly or the other. I mean, not ruin, but devastate for a long time until you come out of it or whatever. And it could lead you into a slumber. And so I would say yes, we need more people that are willing to, when they're ready, when their gestation time comes, to say, I'm doing this, I'm going for it. And I mean, you can think of, I don't want to name names, but just certain people who didn't take a traditional path, or people that took a traditional path and then said, what the heck am I doing with what the heck? I'm censoring myself. Yeah. What the hell am I doing with my life? Yeah. I need a complete shift. And now I have a mission and now I have a vision for at least right now. Mm-hmm. And I think we're all seeking that. And I mean, we're seeking friends like that, hopefully. Mm-hmm. Now, I just universalized everyone in the audience. Okay, but I'm seeking that. I would love to see more of that. I would love to see our leaders who care about what's happening to the children that are being born right now, and thinking forward instead of what's my bank account look like or whatever. Yeah. That's the nihilism. It's all about money or something.
Yeah, definitely. The culture is becoming more and more nihilistic and narcissistic at the same time. They're holding hands, and I think you're probably right. I'm sure that increases the anxiety of young people saying, "Is this it? Is this it really?" And anyway, not to. I almost feel like sometimes the soul is a pretty patient. Whatever the soul is, it's pretty patient. And it's not going to give up. And so, if you're, 30 years old and you basically were a good boy or a good girl your whole life, it doesn't mean like you've ruined anything. It's just like, it's just like, all right, that's the path that you chose, but the soul's not going to give up. Same if you're 65 and you retired and you're like, I did it. And all of a sudden, after that first day of golf, you're like, man, this is amazing. The second day of golf. And then pretty soon you're like, wait, this is not working for me. And there's the soul saying, all right, change your life. I almost feel like maybe dreams are like that too. It's like the never ending influx of unconscious material that you know very little about, and it comes every night. So I don't know. It's like how people come is, I don't know exactly what I'm saying. I guess I'm sort of expressing a kind of faith in that the soul has you don't get one shot, you know?
Well, I was about to say that,
yeah.
because I think in my statement I sounded a little extreme, like your soul was going to be devastated forever, which sounds
but it's possible.
It could be.
Yeah.
It could put you into a slumber. But I guess what I am also hearing the trust, which is that even underneath everything, your soul will try to speak to you, whether it's through dreams. I love keeping a dream journal. I've been doing that for a while, and just trying to learn from them and reflect off of the dreams. But whether it's through dreams or through life events, people have multiple opportunities to awaken to something larger and a larger meaning. Whether they take it or not is ultimately up to them. But I do believe I have that same trust, I suppose, because you're right. You never know when somebody's going to have that shift and what's going to bring it on, and that's limiting our control. I mean, as a therapist, I have to trust. When I first started the work, and I worked with people that were really in dangerous situations, in what would be called labeled dangerous parts of town and big cities I lived in. I had to trust when I went home that I did the best I could to help them, but that they ultimately had responsibility for their circumstance.
Yeah.
And now I'm working with people that aren't so much in danger of physical danger, but more in danger of feeling like they're wasting their life and they don't know what the point of it is. And where's my passion? I've lost my passion. And I think many times you will lose it and we have to regain it. But if we're listening, there's clues about where our focus might go.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, well said. Speaking of clues, because I think clues is a very good metaphor. Like the soul gives clues, dreams, numinous experiences, challenges, life situations. You have life itself that, is the terrain for clues. We've talked about nature as what's my experience in the wild world and what am I drawn to or repulsed by. And these can be clues for the kind of your own map. One of them that was really influential for me was Mary Oliver's poem, The Journey. I bumped into that a number of years ago. Maybe I'd heard it before, but you know how it is. Like you can hear something and you don't hear it. But the opening line, one day you finally knew what you had to do and you began, troubled me. Like, wait a minute. And this was when I was like a big time pastor, And here I am and I'm drawn to this line. One day you finally knew what you had to do and you began. And the beginning is like, all right, what am I supposed to begin here? Like, I'm in the middle of my life. I'm supposed to be, killing it or whatever, or like amassing whatever. I don't know. But that's what drew me. And it was a kind of major clue in my life one day. And I did not know what that was. I didn't know what the thing was. I just kept wrestling with it. I wrote it on my whiteboard in my office, the whole poem. One day you finally knew what you had to do and you began. And I just would read it. I'd read it the next day. I'd read it the next day. I'd read it out loud. One day you finally knew what you had to do and you began. And I don't know if I would say, maybe it was a mixture. On the one hand, I think I was looking for the answer. Like, I need the answer. I want to begin. But another part of me, that was also just the beginning, just to sit in this kind of space of longing and grief at the same time. Grieving, I didn't regret the choices that I had made so much, but there was a kind of deeper grief to it that, how have I fooled myself and other people, maybe as part of the grief? Maybe a deeper grief was something like, what does my soul want to do in the world or be in the world that I'm trying to keep at bay? There's a grief to that, One day you finally knew what you had to do and you began. And then the next line is, and the voices around you kept shouting their bad advice. And that's what, I was experiencing that directly. I would bring up, I don't know if I should do this or that, or bring up my questions or problems, and the voices were shouting bad advice. Whatever the advice was, stick with it, or everybody has hard times, or, or the probably the more problematic voices were the ones that were in my own head, shouting their bad advice, their patterns and their strategies for anxiety and their sometimes I would go back and forth between inflation, I guess it would be called, like complimenting myself, as a pattern, to the opposite, whatever the opposite is. You don't know what you're talking about, or these are the voices shouting their bad advice. You're doing awesome, or you really suck. Neither of those, and each, what's the next line? Mend my life, each voice cried. Like, fix my problems, take on my point of view, whether that's like a voice in my own psyche or externally, like you work for a big church. Fix my life, mend my life, make it better. Don't go anywhere because we need you to do fill in the blank. And everybody has some version of that, even as a mother or a father. Your kids are like, mend my life, mend my life.
Right.
And on the one hand, that's what you have to do. On the other hand, that's also not what you have to do.
Right.
You have to put food on the table, and you have to be as caring and compassionate as you can, and you're not there to mend every wound. So you're actually creating them as you move along. But anyway, one day you finally knew what you had to do, and you began. That the voices around you kept shouting their bad advice, saying, "Mend my life." Each voice cried. But you didn't stop, she says. You kept going. You knew what you had to do. And then she says, it was a wild night. It was already late. That's what she says. It was already late. And I took that to mean like, okay, late in life. All right. I wish I would have done this when I was 21, but I didn't. All right. It was already late and a wild night, and there were branches and sticks in the road, something like that. And then she says, but slowly, the stars began to burn through the sheets of clouds. That's the image. The stars began to burn through the sheets of clouds, and you heard a voice that you slowly recognized as your own, that kept you company. And like even now, that line, I feel just a little emotion, like some grief. Just, yeah, that's the thing. This voice, like almost as if there's a voice beneath your voice. And I was a person who talked for a living, gave sermons, and but there's a voice beneath that maybe you can discover, and it's going to burn through the sheets of clouds, and you only slowly recognize it as your own, which I think is like, I think sometimes I falsely believed, and I think other people do, that if I go on this kind of soul path, boom, I'm going to recognize my real voice, my real calling, and I'm going to get out there after this weekend retreat and put it into the world, No, it's much more like you slowly recognize this voice as your own. And she says, it keeps you company as you strode deeper and deeper into the world. I think that's the line, something like that. As you walk deeper and deeper into the world, determined to save the only life you can save. And that's sort of the end of the poem.
Oh,
something like that.
I like that.
Yeah. So a voice began to burn through the sheets of clouds that kept you company as you strode deeper and deeper into the world, determined to save the only life that you can save. I don't quite have the line, but that for me was like a rudder in the sea of unknowing that I was going through. And it didn't tell me what to do, but it said something like, keep going. And a lot of bad advice is going to come your way. But if you keep going deeper and deeper into the world, determined to save the only life you can save, something like a voice will begin to keep you company. And I began to taste just little bits of that. There it is. And I tasted when I wasn't bringing that voice forth. But anyway, that was like, I think poets and artists, they make a pact with the truth. And it's like, I'm going to tell the truth even if I don't make money. I mean,
right.
Poets don't make money. And so there's something worth bending your ear toward. I mean, I'm not saying, again, everybody needs to read poetry or Mary Oliver, but there's something about listening to those voices who say, I'm gonna make a deal with the truth here. I'm going to speak from the deeper soul place that serves me and the world, that we really, really need right now in the ticker culture, with that ticker information on the bottom of the screen that's just basically bullshit. That this is whatever is urgent is what's true and needed in the world. And the poet says something like, there's a deeper urgency, beneath the ticker. There's some sort of wellspring that I'm in service of, or I'm an agent of dipping down into this wellspring that's much older than anything that CNN can come up with, So anyway, that for me was a clue, that kind of voice, and I think I sometimes will encourage people to take those promptings of curiosity, like, why do I keep listening to so and so? Could be music, music. Certain films or filmmakers, certain artists, but treat it more than just like, I think their work is profound, but more as like a clue for the soul. How is this in some way like a rudder in what is it calling you into, or what is it mirroring back to you, something like that. So anyway.
Yeah, what is this working inside of me? What work is beginning because of this? And what spark has just started to slowly glow? Mm-hmm. And I love that story, and it's a great poem. And yeah, I mean, I guess I don't really have a summary from that other than to say thank you for sharing that.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thanks for having me on the podcast.
Absolutely.
And, my personal feeling is conversations matter, and real conversations that involve some measure of listening, and it's in those kind of weird alchemical mixtures that new things emerge. And I felt like I was learning also as we were going back and forth. So thanks.
Oh, absolutely. It's been my pleasure, Kent. And I'll just say this for people that have just now found you, and if they've listened this far, they are also hopefully wanting to be part of the long form format.
Yeah.
And I always think rich roll, 2.5 hours pretty much every time, and we're getting close.
All right.
But we're not that far. But I wanted to say I've been learning from you and your writings, and also your podcast is fantastic. So I'm glad from that and this conversation as well was always better than my expectations. And so I would just say for your listeners, Kent's podcast link will be in my notes or whatever that are down there, and check it out. I think you'll like it.
Thanks.
And there you have it. This has been another episode of the Intentional Clinician Podcast with Paul Krauss. I really enjoyed my conversation with Kent Dobson, and I think he's got a lot of valuable things and resources to say. Another way to find out about Kent Dobson is to go to his website at www.kentdobson.com or check out his podcast, Hints and Guesses, which is on most podcast applications. If you're in need of a counseling appointment, don't hesitate to make an appointment with a counselor in your local area. You can also make an appointment with people in Grand Rapids at my office, which is Health for Life Grand Rapids, www.healthforlifegr.com, and you can also find us now under our new wing, the Trauma-Informed Counseling Center of Grand Rapids. And I discussed a lot of nature-based activities. I would recommend that you do not do any of these activities unless you are under the supervision or guidance of a well-known nature-based therapist. The recording you just listened to consists of the personal opinions of Paul Krauss and his guest, and while these are based upon their experience and things they have read, they should not be viewed as the definitive opinion on the subject. Listening to this podcast is not a substitute for treatment. If you are in crisis, please call 911 or the National Suicide Prevention Line immediately, which is 1-800-273-8255. And thank you everyone for listening. I appreciate it. And if you like this podcast, please share with your friends and family.
And another life, level field, what goal is the game? Any answer, the question remains. To flourish and without expansion, undiscarded hate or disadvantage in tragic state. No delusion about what is great in another life. In another life. Distress, breed and obedient, no deviant, no sway in praise or in incense. In another life. In another life. Power seen in true and clear light. Loss unburdened in natural flight.